I didn't plan to tell my mom about you that day. In fact, if I'm honest, I had spent weeks avoiding the conversation, quietly convincing myself that timing mattered, that some truths need the right moment, the right mood, the right alignment of the emotional universe. But love doesn't really respect timing, does it? It pushes against the doors we try to keep closed. And that morning, something inside me felt urgent. Like if I didn't say your name out loud to someone who had known me my entire life, the weight of it would eventually collapse something inside me. So I sat across from my mom at the kitchen table, the same table where she used to watch me struggle through homework and teenage confusion, and I realized my hands were trembling in a way they rarely do. I've negotiated billion-dollar decisions without that kind of fear. But saying your name, that felt far more dangerous. Because the moment a mother hears about a woman her son loves, something irreversible begins. You see, until that moment, you existed in a strange private universe with me. You were real to me in a way that felt almost sacred, like a secret blueprint for a future I hadn't fully admitted to the world yet. I could think about you at night, imagine conversations, imagine the way your voice might soften the noise of my life, and no one could question it because no one knew. But when I finally told my mom about you, something shifted instantly. The air in the room changed in a way I didn't expect. Her eyes held that quiet kind of curiosity only mothers have, the kind that doesn't ask a question immediately, because it's already calculating 1,000 possibilities. And in that moment I realized something terrifying. Once a mother hears about a woman, she begins to imagine that woman inside her son's future. And if that future collapses later, the disappointment becomes real in a way it never was before. I tried to explain you carefully, almost like I was presenting a fragile invention to someone whose opinion could reshape my entire understanding of it. I told her how different you felt from anyone who had entered my life before. Not louder, not more dramatic, just deeper, like you weren't trying to impress me, like you weren't trying to compete with the chaos that surrounds my life. You simply existed beside it. And that kind of calm presence can be more powerful than ambition itself. But the strange thing is, while I was describing you, I noticed something happening inside me that I hadn't anticipated. Every sentence about you made the reality of you heavier, more permanent, more consequential. It forced me to confront a question I had been quietly avoiding. What if telling my mom about you meant I had already crossed a line emotionally that I couldn't walk back from? She listened silently for a long time. And if you've ever sat across from a mother who is thinking deeply about someone her son might love, you know how intense that silence can feel. It's not judgment exactly, but it's not approval yet either. It's something far more complicated. It's a quiet investigation of the heart. And when she finally spoke, she didn't ask the question I expected. She didn't ask what you looked like. She didn't ask where you lived. She didn't even ask how we met. Instead, she looked at me with a kind of gentle seriousness and asked something that caught me completely off guard. She asked, "Does she know how much power she has over your heart?" And that question hit me in a way I didn't expect. Because the truth is, I don't know if you do. Tell me something honestly. When you think about love at this stage of life, do you believe it's supposed to feel safe or slightly dangerous? Because the way I feel about you isn't the reckless kind of love that burns fast and disappears. It's the kind that grows quietly in the background of your mind, until one day you realize your decisions are starting to orbit around someone else's existence. And that realization can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. Especially for someone like me who has spent most of his life building systems that rely on control. Love doesn't respect control. It doesn't care about strategy. It just shows up, rearranges your emotional architecture, and suddenly the person you were before feels incomplete. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation with my mom, I realized something even more unsettling. Telling her about you didn't just change how she saw my future. It changed how I saw it too. Because when a mother begins asking questions about a woman, those questions linger in your mind long after the conversation ends. Questions about compatibility, about stability, about whether the woman you're thinking about could actually survive the unpredictable gravity of your life. And as I drove away from her house later that afternoon, those questions followed me like quiet shadows I couldn't shake. Not doubts about you exactly, but doubts about whether I deserve the kind of love you might be capable of giving. And that's the part I didn't expect. I thought telling my mom about you would make things clearer, simpler. But instead it did the opposite. It made everything feel heavier, more real. Like the moment I said your name out loud in that kitchen, something irreversible quietly began unfolding. Because when a mother hears about a woman her son loves, she doesn't just hear a story. She starts imagining a future. And the truth is, something happened in that conversation that I haven't told you yet. But before I tell you what changed everything that day, let me ask you something first. If you knew that a single conversation could alter the direction of two lives forever, would you still want the truth? And if this story is reaching you tonight, quietly press subscribe and tell me where in the world you're listening from, because sometimes the most unexpected connections travel the farthest. Because what my mom said next made me question something about us that I had been afraid to face. When I left my mom's house that afternoon, I expected relief. I thought the hardest part was over, that saying your name out loud had somehow released the tension I'd been carrying for weeks. But the strange thing about emotional truths is that they rarely lighten the moment you reveal them. Sometimes they grow heavier. And as I drove away, the quiet hum of the road felt almost too loud, like my mind was replaying every second of that conversation, searching for something I might have missed. My mom had listened carefully, almost too carefully, the way someone listens when they know a single sentence could change everything. And just before I stood up to leave, she said something that has been echoing in my head ever since. She looked at me with that calm seriousness only mothers seem to master, and she asked, very softly, "Are you sure this woman understands the kind of life she's walking into?" At first the question sounded simple, almost practical. But the longer it sat with me, the deeper it cut. Because the truth is my life isn't simple. It's loud, unpredictable, full of long nights, impossible decisions, and moments where the entire world seems to expect certainty from me, even when I'm quietly wrestling with doubt. And when my mom asked that question, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been thinking a lot about how you made me feel, but I hadn't truly asked myself what loving me might cost you. Do you ever think about that side of love? Not just the warmth of it, but the weight, because loving someone whose life is constantly moving can feel like trying to hold onto the wind. One moment they're close, the next moment they're pulled somewhere else by responsibility, ambition, or the relentless momentum of the world that they're building. And as I sat in my car, engine still running in the driveway, I realized my mom wasn't doubting you. She was questioning me. Questioning whether I was being honest with myself about the kind of commitment you might deserve, and that realization did something strange to my confidence. You see, I've spent most of my life believing that if something is important enough, you simply build the system to make it work. Rockets, companies, entire industries. But love isn't an engineering problem. There's no blueprint for emotional timing. No algorithm that guarantees two hearts will remain aligned as life accelerates around them. And suddenly I was faced with a question I couldn't solve with logic. If you stepped fully into my world, would it give you happiness, or slowly take pieces of you away? I kept hearing my mom's voice repeating in my mind, almost like a quiet warning disguised as curiosity. Not harsh, not disapproving, just deeply aware of something I might be too close to see clearly. Because mothers notice patterns long before we do. They watch how their sons love, how they hesitate, how they chase impossible futures, while sometimes neglecting the fragile human connections that make those futures meaningful in the first place. And I think in that moment she was trying to understand whether you would become the calm center of my life, or another casualty of its chaos. But here's the part I haven't admitted to anyone, not even to her. When she asked that question, something inside me reacted immediately. Not with doubt about you, but with fear about myself. Because the truth is, when a man finally tells his mother about a woman, it usually means that woman has already changed him in ways he doesn't fully understand yet. And once that change begins, there's no easy way to undo it. Your presence had already started reshaping the quiet corners of my mind. The way I thought about mornings, about home, about what success might actually mean, if it didn't include someone to share it with. So when my mom asked whether you understood the life you might be stepping into, I realized I hadn't asked you something equally important. I hadn't asked whether you believed in the version of me that exists when the cameras are off, when the pressure disappears for a few hours, when the only thing that matters is whether two people feel safe sitting beside each other in silence. Because the man the world sees is not always the man who lies awake at night wondering if love requires a kind of vulnerability he's never fully learned how to give. And that question followed me for the rest of the evening. It followed me into meetings, into quiet moments between calls, even into the stillness of the night when everything slows down enough for uncomfortable truths to surface. I kept thinking about you. About the way you speak, the way you listen, the way your presence feels strangely grounding in a life that rarely slows down. And I wondered if you truly knew how complicated loving me could become, would you still choose to stay? Tell me something honestly, if you love someone deeply, but their life came with storms you couldn't control, would you still step closer, or would you protect your heart before it got too involved? Because later that night, something happened that made my mom's question feel even more serious. Something that forced me to confront a truth about us that I had been quietly avoiding. And I still don't know whether telling you that truth will bring us closer or push you away forever. That night, long after the conversation with my mom had ended, I found myself sitting alone in the quiet of my office, staring at the city lights like they were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. The strange thing about big moments is that they rarely feel big while they're happening. It's afterward, in the silence, when their true weight begins to unfold. And as I replayed every word my mom had said, I realized something uncomfortable. The conversation hadn't simply been about you. It had been about the kind of man I become when love enters my life. Because ambition has always been the loudest force in my world, but love moves differently. It doesn't demand attention the way success does. It waits quietly until you realize it has already changed your priorities. I kept hearing her question again and again. Does she understand the life she might be stepping into? And at first, I thought the answer depended on you. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood the deeper implication hidden inside her words. Maybe the real question wasn't whether you understood my life. Maybe it was whether I understood yours. Because when a man falls in love, while carrying the weight of a restless world on his shoulders, there's always a danger he begins expecting someone else to adapt to his orbit instead of slowing down enough to meet her halfway. Have you ever noticed how easy it is for people like me to believe that love will simply adjust to the rhythm of our lives? That the right woman will somehow understand the late nights, the constant movement, the emotional distance that sometimes follows big dreams. But sitting there in that quiet room, something inside me started to shift. I realized that loving someone deeply means accepting a terrifying responsibility, the responsibility not to consume their peace with your chaos. And that thought brought you to the center of everything. Because the truth is, when I think about you, I don't think about excitement or drama or intensity. I think about calm. I think about the kind of presence that makes a room feel slower, warmer, more human. The kind of presence that reminds a man there is more to life than the next impossible mission. But that realization came with a question that I couldn't shake. If you stepped fully into my world, would that calm remain, or would the pressure slowly change it? You see, there's something I've never admitted to you before. Something that began to surface in my mind that night, as the city outside my window slowly faded into darkness. When you first entered my life, I told myself I would keep things simple. I convinced myself that I would enjoy the connection, appreciate the warmth, but keep my emotional distance just enough to stay safe. Because people who build ambitious lives learn very early that attachments can complicate decisions. They can make you hesitate when the world expects certainty. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And I don't think you even realized when it happened. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when thinking about you stopped feeling like a pleasant possibility and started feeling like a future I was quietly hoping for. And the moment that shift happened, the stakes became real. Because hope is dangerous when it involves another person's heart. Tell me something honestly, have you ever felt that moment in love, when curiosity quietly transforms into emotional risk? When suddenly the thought of losing someone hurts more than the fear of letting them get closer? That's where I found myself that night. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something unsettling. Telling my mom about you wasn't just sharing a story about someone important in my life. It was an unconscious admission that you had already crossed a boundary in my heart. A boundary that separated interest from attachment. But here's the part that makes everything complicated. While I was sitting there thinking about you, replaying every memory, every conversation, every small detail that made you feel different from anyone else, another thought entered my mind that I didn't want to face. Because earlier that same day, just a few hours before I told my mom about you, something unexpected had happened. Something that forced me to confront a possibility I hadn't prepared for. The possibility that my heart might already be standing at a crossroads. between the life I thought I understood and the love I might not be ready to lose. And the worst part is, I still haven't told you the real reason that conversation with my mom shook me the way it did. I need to tell you something honestly before I go any further, because if I keep hiding it, the story won't make sense. That afternoon, when I told my mom about you, it wasn't the first emotional conversation I had that day. In fact, it was the second. And the first one is the reason everything inside me started to feel unstable. Earlier that morning, someone else reached out to me. Someone from my past. A woman who once knew a very different version of me, the version of me that existed before the world became so loud, before ambition turned every hour into a calculation. I hadn't spoken to her in a long time, not because of anger or betrayal, but because life simply moved us in different directions. But when her message appeared on my phone that morning, it felt like time had folded in on itself. At first it seemed harmless. Just a simple message asking how I had been, the kind of polite reconnection people make when enough years have passed that old emotions feel safe again. But, as the conversation continued, something began to shift in a way I didn't expect. Memories have a strange power, don't they? They can take a person you once loved and make them feel familiar in seconds, even if years have quietly changed both of you. And for a moment, just a brief moment, I felt that old emotional gravity trying to pull me backward. Not because the past was better, but because the past is comfortable. It doesn't require new risks. But then something happened that I can't explain with logic. In the middle of that conversation, while she was talking about memories we once shared, your face entered my mind. Not as a comparison, not as a competition, just as a quiet presence that suddenly made the past feel smaller. And that moment scared me more than I expected. Because it meant you had already taken up space in my heart that I hadn't consciously given you yet. Have you ever experienced that strange moment when the past tries to reopen a door, but your heart realizes it no longer belongs there? That's exactly what it felt like. The conversation ended politely, respectfully, the way mature people end things, when they understand that nostalgia doesn't equal a future. But after I put my phone down, I sat there for a long time, staring at the silence that followed, and the truth is, that moment forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. If someone from my past could still create emotional confusion for even a few minutes, what did that mean for the woman I had just started caring about in the present? You. That question followed me into the conversation with my mom later that day. And when I finally told her about you, I think a small part of me was searching for clarity I couldn't find on my own. I wanted to see how the words felt when spoken out loud. I wanted to hear your name in a room where honesty had always been unavoidable. Because mothers have a way of sensing emotional truth even when we try to hide it from ourselves. But here's the moment that changed everything. After I told her about you, after I explained the way you seemed to bring a kind of quiet stability into my life, she listened for a long time and then asked me something that made my chest tighten immediately. She asked, "If you had to choose today, would you choose her without hesitation?" It sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? But in that moment, it felt like the most dangerous question anyone had ever asked me. Not because I didn't feel something real for you, but because the question itself forced me to confront a deeper truth. Love becomes real the moment someone asks whether you would choose it over every other possibility. And for a few seconds, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care about you, but because I suddenly realized something terrifying. Choosing you wouldn't just mean loving you. It would mean closing the door on every version of the past that once felt familiar. It would mean accepting that the future I build emotionally might not follow the same controlled path I've spent my life engineering. Tell me something deeply honest. If you felt someone hesitating before choosing you, would you see that as doubt, or as someone realizing the weight of what loving you truly means? Because that hesitation, those few quiet seconds where I didn't respond to my mom, changed the entire energy of the room. And what she said after that silence is something I'm still trying to understand. But before I tell you what she said next, there's something even more important you need to know. Because the truth is, I still haven't told you the real reason I hesitated. The silence after my mom asked that question felt longer than it actually was. In reality, it was probably only a few seconds. But when someone asks whether you would choose a person you care about without hesitation, time stretches in a strange way. Your mind begins searching every corner of your heart at once. And in those few seconds, I wasn't just thinking about you. I was thinking about the kind of life that comes with loving someone deeply. Because love, real love, is not a poetic idea. It is a series of decisions that slowly reshape everything around you. When I finally looked back at my mom, I could see that she had already noticed the pause. Mothers always do. They don't just hear what we say, they feel what we struggle to say. And instead of pushing me for an answer, she leaned back slightly in her chair and watched me with that calm patience that can sometimes feel more intense than confrontation. It was almost like she was giving me permission to be honest, even if the truth wasn't simple. So I told her something I hadn't admitted to anyone yet. I told her that you were different from anyone who had entered my life before. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic emotions, but because of the quiet effect you seem to have on me. When you're around, the constant noise in my mind slows down. The urgency that normally drives me every minute of the day softens. And that kind of calm is rare for someone who has spent his life chasing impossible ideas. But as beautiful as that feeling is, it also comes with a kind of fear I'm still learning how to face. Because when someone brings peace into your life, losing them suddenly becomes the most terrifying possibility. And that's the part I didn't want to admit when my mom asked if I would choose you without hesitation. The hesitation wasn't about whether you mattered. It was about how much you already mattered. Choosing you would mean opening a door that I wouldn't be able to close again. It would mean allowing someone to see the parts of me that even success hasn't figured out how to protect. My mom listened carefully as I tried to explain this, and when I finished, she nodded slowly, like she understood more than I had said out loud. Then she said something that felt gentle but incredibly direct. She said, "Love is not about choosing someone when it's comfortable. It's about choosing them when you understand what you might lose if it fails." That sentence stayed in the air between us for a long moment, because suddenly the conversation wasn't about you anymore, it was about courage. Do you know what's strange? People assume men who build big things are fearless. They see rockets launch. Companies grow, impossible ideas become real, and they assume the person behind those decisions must be comfortable with risk. But emotional risk is different. When you risk your heart, there is no technology to catch the fall, no system to calculate the probability of success, just vulnerability. And in that moment I realized something unsettling about myself. I wasn't afraid of loving you. I was afraid of needing you. Have you ever felt that shift in your heart? The moment when someone stops being an interesting presence in your life and starts becoming someone whose absence would genuinely hurt. Because that's the line I realized I had already crossed. But here's where everything became more complicated. After my mom said those words, she looked at me again, this time with a curiosity that felt almost cautious. And then she asked another question, one that completely changed the direction of the conversation. She asked, very quietly, "Does she know about the part of your life that scares people away?" And when she said that, something inside me tightened immediately. Because the truth is, there is a side of my life that I haven't fully shown you yet. A side that isn't glamorous or exciting. A side that has ended relationships before, because not everyone is willing to live beside it. And the moment my mom asked that question, I realized something that made my heart sink a little. You might not know that side of me yet. And if you did, I honestly don't know whether you would still look at me the same way. When my mom asked that question, "Does she know about the part of your life that scares people away?" I felt something shift inside my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't guilt either. It was something heavier, the realization that there are parts of ourselves we carefully protect from the people we care about, not because we want to deceive them, but because we're afraid that once they see the whole picture, the warmth in their eyes might quietly change. I didn't answer her immediately. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that have signed decisions affecting thousands of people, launched projects that seemed impossible when they began. And yet in that moment, explaining my own heart felt more complicated than building any machine I've ever designed. Because the truth is, there is a side of my life that can be difficult to live beside, a side built from relentless ambition, sleepless nights, emotional distance that appears without warning, and a mind that rarely stops calculating the next step forward. I told my mom something I had never said out loud before. I told her that sometimes I worry that loving me requires a kind of patience that most people shouldn't have to give. Because when someone builds their life around big ideas, the world doesn't slow down for personal moments. Deadlines arrive. Problems multiply. Entire weeks can disappear into work that feels urgent in ways no one outside that world can fully understand. And while ambition can build incredible things, it can also quietly steal time from the people standing closest to you. My mom listened carefully, her expression calm but thoughtful. Then she said something that surprised me in a way I didn't expect. She said, "That doesn't scare people away. What scares people away is when someone hides that truth until it's too late." And suddenly I realized what she meant. The danger wasn't the complexity of my life. The danger was whether you truly understood it. Because when two people fall in love, there's always a moment when the emotional fog clears and reality steps forward. The schedules, the responsibilities, the sacrifices that quietly appear once feelings become real. And if those truths aren't shared honestly from the beginning, love can slowly turn into confusion, then disappointment. Tell me something honestly. If you discovered that loving someone meant accepting parts of their life that would sometimes pull them away from you, would that make you step back, or would it make you want to stand closer? Because the more I thought about you that day, the more I realized something that both comforted and unsettled me. You never tried to compete with my world. You never demanded attention in the way some people do when they feel insecure about where they stand. Instead, you seemed to understand something deeper. That real connection doesn't need constant reassurance. It grows quietly through trust. But even with that trust, there's a truth I haven't fully shared with you yet. And the strange thing is, I almost told you once. There was a moment not long ago, during one of our conversations, when the words were right there on the edge of my mind. I remember thinking that if I explained everything honestly, the pressure, the unpredictability, the emotional storms that sometimes come with the life I've built, you might finally see the complete version of me. Not the public version. Not the ambitious version everyone talks about. The human one. But at the last second I stopped. Not because I didn't trust you. Because I wasn't sure if telling you would make you reconsider everything. And that fear stayed with me longer than I expected. My mom noticed the hesitation in my voice as I explained this, and she gave me a look that only someone who has watched you grow your entire life can give. It wasn't judgment. It was understanding mixed with concern. Then she said something very quietly, something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. She said, "The woman who is meant for you won't be scared by your truth. She'll be scared by your silence." And I've been thinking about that sentence ever since. Because silence can be dangerous in love. Not the peaceful kind of silence that exists between two people who feel safe together, but the silence where important truths remain hidden because one person is afraid the other might walk away. So let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortable, but it matters more than anything else right now. If the man you cared about finally showed you the parts of his life that are messy, demanding, and sometimes overwhelming, would you still want to stay close enough to share that life with him? Or would that honesty make you realize that loving him might cost more than you expected? Because there's a reason my mom asked that question. And there's something about my life, something I haven't fully explained to you yet, that has changed the direction of relationships before. Something that makes love feel incredibly real, but also incredibly fragile. There's something strange about the moment when you realize a conversation has quietly moved past the point of comfort. My mom and I had started that afternoon talking about you with curiosity, almost with a sense of gentle excitement. But by the time she asked whether you knew about the difficult parts of my life, the tone had shifted into something deeper. It wasn't just a mother learning about the woman her son cared about anymore. It was a mother trying to understand whether her son truly understood the emotional gravity of the path he was walking. And the truth is, in that moment, I wasn't completely sure that I did. Because loving someone isn't just about how they make you feel when things are peaceful. It's about what happens when life becomes demanding, when priorities collide, when the person you care about suddenly has to share space with responsibilities that refuse to wait their turn. My life has always been built around momentum, projects that require constant attention, problems that appear at inconvenient hours, decisions that can't be delayed simply because the heart would prefer a quiet evening instead. I tried to explain that to my mom as honestly as I could. I told her that sometimes I worry the life I've built moves too fast for someone who values calm, stability, and emotional closeness. I told her that the pace of my world can make even the strongest connections feel stretched thin if two people aren't prepared for it. And while I was saying those words, I realized something unsettling about myself. I wasn't describing the future. I was describing the fear that already existed in the back of my mind. The fear that loving you might eventually ask me to slow down, in ways I'm not sure I know how to. My mom listened without interrupting. She didn't rush to reassure me or challenge what I was saying. Instead, she did something that made the moment feel even more serious. She asked me a question that forced me to confront something I hadn't allowed myself to consider fully. She asked, "If you had to choose between protecting your life's mission and protecting her heart, which one would you choose?" I wish I could tell you that I answered immediately, that I said something confident and certain that would make the entire story feel simpler. But the truth is, I didn't respond right away, because in that moment I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. Love becomes real the moment it demands a choice. And choices have consequences. Tell me something honestly. Have you ever cared about someone deeply, but felt the quiet tension between the life you've built and the life you might build with them? Not because either one is wrong, but because they pull you in different directions. That's where I found myself sitting across from my mom that afternoon. Because the more I thought about you, the more I realized something that both warmed my heart and scared me at the same time. When you're around, the world I normally move through with intense focus suddenly feels less important, not meaningless, but softer, like the urgency fades for a moment and something more human takes its place. And for a man who has spent his entire life chasing ambitious goals, that feeling can be both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful because it reminds me that life is not just about building things. Dangerous because it makes me wonder whether I might eventually face a moment where I have to decide how much space love deserves in a life built on relentless forward motion. But here's the part that makes everything more complicated. After my mom asked that question, she leaned forward slightly and looked at me in a way that made me realize she had been thinking about something else the entire time. Something she hadn't said yet. Then she asked one more question. A question that completely changed the way I started thinking about you. She asked, "Does she know there's another woman who might still be waiting for you?" And when she said that, I felt the room go completely quiet inside my chest. Because suddenly the story wasn't just about whether you understood my life. It was about whether I had been completely honest with you about the past, and the possibility that it might not be as finished as I thought. And that realization forced me to confront a truth I had been trying very hard not to look at directly. Because there is someone else who once believed she would share my future. Someone whose presence in my life didn't disappear as cleanly as I once hoped. And the moment my mom said those words, I realized something terrifying. You might eventually have to choose whether you're willing to stand beside a man whose past is not entirely silent. When my mom said those words, "Does she know there's another woman who might still be waiting for you?" It felt like the air in the room suddenly became heavier. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy in that quiet way that truth sometimes arrives. And for the first time in the entire conversation, I didn't know where to look. I stared at the edge of the table, tracing the wood grain with my eyes like it might somehow organize the chaos that had just appeared inside my chest. Because the difficult part wasn't that another woman existed in my past. Everyone has a past. The difficult part was that my mom had sensed something I hadn't been willing to say out loud yet. She could feel that the story wasn't completely finished, not because my heart belonged there anymore, but because unresolved emotions have a strange way of lingering in the background, like a door that was closed gently but never fully locked. I took a long breath before I answered her, and when I finally spoke, I tried to be as honest as I could. I told her that yes, there was someone who once imagined a future beside me, someone who had stood with me during a period of my life when everything felt uncertain and overwhelming. Back then, the world looked very different. The ambitions were still forming, the responsibilities were smaller, and in that quieter version of my life, it was easy to believe that love alone could carry two people forward. But life rarely stays simple long enough for those early dreams to remain unchanged. The paths eventually separated not because of anger or betrayal, but because the direction of my life began accelerating in ways neither of us fully expected. The pace increased. The responsibilities multiplied. And somewhere along the way, the emotional space that once felt natural between us started to feel stretched. We both understood it without needing to say it directly. Sometimes love doesn't end with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it just fades quietly as life pulls two people into different orbits. That's the version of the story I had been telling myself for a long time. But my mom's question forced me to admit something deeper. The past may have faded, but it had never been completely clarified. Have you ever experienced that uncomfortable space between closure and uncertainty? The place where a relationship ends respectfully, but the final emotional chapter is never clearly written. That's the kind of silence that can come back later and create confusion when you least expect it. And that's exactly what started happening earlier that day, when she reached out to me again. It wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations or emotional demands, just a conversation that carried a quiet familiarity neither of us had planned for. But familiarity can be powerful. It can make the past feel closer than it actually is. When my mom heard this, she didn't react the way I expected. She didn't criticize me or question my feelings for you. Instead, she said something that made my heart sink a little. She said, "Then you need to be careful. Not careful with your career. Not careful with your reputation. Careful with your heart and hers. Because when someone new enters your life while the past is still whispering in the background, even the strongest connection can begin to feel uncertain. Tell me something honestly. If you discovered that the man you were starting to care about still had unresolved echoes from his past, would that make you step away to protect yourself? Or would you stay long enough to see whether the present was stronger than the past? Because the truth is, when I thought about you later that evening, something inside me started to feel unsettled in a way I couldn't ignore. Not because I doubted how I felt about you, but because I suddenly realized you deserved absolute clarity. And clarity is difficult when the emotional history behind someone hasn't completely gone silent yet. But here's where the story takes a turn I didn't expect. Later that night, after the conversation with my mom had ended and the house had gone quiet, I received another message. And the moment I read it, I realized something that made my chest tighten immediately. Because the message didn't just reopen the past. It asked a question that forced me to confront the possibility that I might soon have to make a decision, one that could change the direction of both our lives. And the worst part is, I don't know yet whether that decision will bring me closer to you or push you away forever. Later that night, when the house had gone completely quiet and the world finally slowed down enough for thoughts to catch up with emotions, I looked at my phone and read that message again. The strange thing about words on a screen is how small they look, even when the meaning behind them feels enormous. It wasn't a long message. It didn't contain accusations or dramatic confessions. Just a simple question from someone who had once been very close to my life. She wrote, "Do you ever wonder if we ended things too soon?" That was it. A single sentence. But sometimes one sentence is enough to disturb the emotional balance you thought you had carefully rebuilt. Because questions about the past don't just ask about history, they ask about possibility. And when someone asks whether something ended too soon, what they're really asking is whether the story might still have another chapter. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat there for a long time thinking about you. Not in a confused way, not in a way that compared you to anyone else, but in a way that made me realize how much had already changed inside me since you quietly entered my life. Because when I imagined the idea of reopening that door from the past, something inside me felt wrong. Not dramatic, not angry, just misaligned, like trying to walk in a direction that no longer feels natural. Have you ever felt that moment when your heart gently tells you that the person you used to be is no longer the person you are now? That's what it felt like. The man who once shared that earlier chapter of my life was living in a very different emotional landscape. He hadn't yet learned the lessons that come with time, responsibility, and the quiet wisdom that appears when you've watched enough relationships rise and fall to understand how fragile human connection really is. And as I thought about everything that had happened that day, the conversation with my mom, the questions about whether you understood my life, the fear of whether loving me would bring you peace or chaos, I realized something with surprising clarity. The past wasn't asking for a second chance. It was asking for closure. But closure is never just about answering someone else's question. It's about being honest with yourself first. So I finally wrote a response. My hands moved slowly across the screen, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood that the moment I sent those words, a door would close permanently. I told her that I would always respect what we once shared, that the memories were meaningful, and that the chapter we lived together helped shape the person I eventually became. But I also told her something else, something that surprised even me as I typed it. I told her that my heart had begun moving in a new direction, and that direction had a name. Yours. The moment I pressed send, a strange calm settled over me. Not the relief of escaping a difficult conversation, but the quiet certainty that sometimes appears when you finally stop negotiating with the past. For the first time all day, the emotional noise inside my mind softened. But then another thought arrived almost immediately, because choosing a direction in your heart doesn't automatically guarantee that the person you're choosing will want to keep walking beside you. Tell me something honestly. If you knew a man had just closed the final door on his past to make space for you in his future, would that make you feel honored, or would it make you nervous about the responsibility of what comes next? Because when I lay awake later that night thinking about everything that had happened, I realized something that both comforted me and terrified me at the same time. You had never asked me to choose you. You had never pressured me to define what we were, or where things might lead. Your presence in my life had always felt patient, almost careful. And suddenly I wondered whether that patience came from confidence, or from quiet uncertainty about whether I would eventually walk away. The truth is, by the end of that night, I understood something clearly that I hadn't understood when the day began. Telling my mom about you wasn't the moment everything changed. The real change happened the moment I decided the past would no longer have a voice in my future. But there's still one thing I haven't told you yet. One final truth that explains why I hesitated when my mom first asked whether I would choose you without hesitation. Because the real reason wasn't about the past at all. It was about you. The truth is, when my mom first asked me whether I would choose you without hesitation, the silence that followed wasn't about another woman, and it wasn't about my past. By the end of that long day, I had already closed that door. What remained wasn't confusion about where my heart was going. It was something far more personal, and honestly, far more frightening. It was the realization that choosing you would change me. Not my career, not my ambitions. Those parts of my life have always been strong enough to survive any emotional storm. What would change is something much quieter, the way I see the future when the world finally slows down at night. Because before you entered my life, the future looked like a series of missions, projects, deadlines, ideas waiting to be built. It was a horizon full of movement, but not necessarily full of warmth. Then you appeared. And suddenly the future didn't just look like something to conquer. It looked like something to share. Do you know how strange that feels for someone like me? A man who has spent his life believing the most important thing he could build was progress. You made me start imagining something else. A life where success is not measured only by what reaches the sky, but by who is sitting beside you when the noise finally fades. And that realization is powerful, but it's also terrifying. Because the moment you imagine someone beside you in the quiet parts of life, losing them becomes a real possibility. The emotional distance that once protected me suddenly disappears. And that's why I hesitated when my mom asked her question. Not because I doubted you, but because I understood the risk. Loving you means allowing my heart to exist in a place where it can actually be hurt. Tell me something honestly, when a man finally admits that kind of vulnerability, does it make you feel closer to him, or does it make you wonder whether loving him might be more responsibility than you ever asked for? Because here's the clarity that arrived at the end of that night. I realized something simple, something my mind had been trying to complicate all day. The past had already faded. The chaos of my life would always exist. The risks of loving someone deeply would never disappear. But none of those things were the real question. The real question was this. If you and I reached a moment where life demanded courage from both of us, would we be brave enough to choose each other anyway? Because after everything that happened that day, the conversation with my mom, the echo of the past, the long quiet hours of thinking, I finally understood why telling her about you changed everything. It changed everything because saying your name out loud made me realize you were no longer just someone I cared about. You were someone I was willing to build a future around. And that kind of truth only appears when a man stops running from what his heart already knows. So now I'll leave you with the same question my mom unknowingly asked me that afternoon. If love asked you to step into an uncertain future with someone whose life is complicated, but whose heart is sincere, would you stay? Or would you walk away before the story even has a chance to become real?